NativeScript aims to bring native platform development to JavaScript in as natural a way as it can. It wants to allow you to do platform things from JavaScript, things like Kotlin, Swift, Objective-C, Java.
Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. We're really excited to have Eduardo Speroni on and Nathan Walker. And we're going to be talking about a topic that I'm actually really excited about because I heard about this about a decade ago, and I was like really interested in it, like played around it a bit in the early days. So we're going to be talking about NativeScript today. And it's crazy to me that it's been a decade. I was like going back and like looking at it. It's like, yeah, I think it was like made in 2014, but really publicly announced in 2015. So I was like, wow, that's crazy. It's been that long, but I'm super excited to talk about this. But before we begin, would you each like to give an intro? Nathan, why don't you start?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Nathan Walker. I'm co-founder in Studio and a member on the working group or technical steering committee with NativeScript, and love working around that kind of stuff. So excited to be here.
I'm Eduardo Speroni. I'm also on the TSC, and I've been working mostly with Valor software, but I also work with Nathan on a few projects.
Awesome. So let's just dive into it with one of y'all like to sort of just describe what is NativeScript, and maybe some of our listeners are probably familiar with React Native. Maybe we can kind of compare and contrast with that.
Yeah, maybe I'll start on that one. I mean, NativeScript aims to bring native platform development to JavaScript in as natural a way as it can. It wants to allow you to do platform things from JavaScript, and therefore it sort of brings platform languages to JavaScript, things like Kotlin, Swift, Objective-C, Java. You can do constructs. You can even use practices and constructs that you would use in Objective-C, philosophical structures and approaches like delegates, for example, in Objective-C. You can do those in JavaScript with NativeScript, and really aims to bring the entire JS ecosystem to platform land. That comes with a lot of things to talk about there, but I think maybe in a nutshell, that's what it is. But along with JavaScript comes all the things you would expect, like web approach, CSS, being able to do standard view, templating, and markup, marry that with CSS to develop an app.
So is it like React Native, where you're composing native stuff to create an app, or I saw there was CSS in there, or is it more of a web view, but you can hook into the native stuff and then show stuff in a web view?
React Native and NativeScript have similarities in what you're working with, because you're working with the platform view language. So, a UI view, for example, in UIKit on iOS is something you'd work with through a view construct in React Native. NativeScript, you'd work with the same thing in, say, a grid layout or a stack layout. There's even talks to maybe bring a singular view like React Native to NativeScript. So you're working with the same view level between React Native and NativeScript, but that's probably where the similarities end in terms of the approach, because NativeScript takes more of an approach that you are dealing with the platform kind of as is. You tend to work with the platform language as you would when you're in Objective-C or Swift. And so you're not having to necessarily go too much in and around the platform maybe sometimes.
Yeah, and to just expand a bit on that, NativeScript, the UI layer, you can say, it's all or most of it is done directly in JavaScript. So you don't need to get, you don't need to write native code to build an UI even from scratch.
I remember when I discovered NativeScript, around that time, I was still sort of messing around with Cordova apps. I don't really remember what the state of, I don't think React Native was really much of a thing then, or I wasn't aware of it at all. I don't even think it existed then. But I'd been doing a lot of Cordova apps, and you get to this point where it's like, okay, well, now you have to write like native extensions, like, in the app framework. So Cordova, for those people who haven't heard of it, is like a way to just make apps with a web view. That was really kind of all it was, is like package up a website, add as an app. And the thing about NativeScript that just seemed magic is, Nathan, like you said earlier, you kind of generate JavaScript bindings for the entirety of the native APIs. Like everything that you can call, in Objective-C on iOS or in Java on Android, you can call with JavaScript. And that like blew my mind. It's like, wait, so I can write a JavaScript file that kind of like hooks on different platforms and uses the bare platform primitives. One of my questions that I have that I always wondered is like, is that really slow, like doing the native bridging? This is something that we have a problem with like WASM these days, is like there is a cost to translating from one data type to the other, like one, the bridging cost. But so what's the story with like performance in NativeScript?
I'll let Ed touch on that in a minute, but maybe I'll comment on one thing, which is that very aspect of it, which is bringing all platform bindings to JavaScript, is I think what rightfully so scared people too in the beginning. Is a bit maybe ahead of its time at that time. And the thought of doing that, I think rightfully so, scared some people, excited some people. And so along with that came some controversy. And there's always controversy around bringing anything innovative out there, and so there was a lot of uncharted territory in that. And so in the 10 years that have spanned by, that approach has been brought to production in a lot of different aspects. And so let's talk about the performance nature of that, and maybe Ed, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, so NativeScript is like does most things like the most optimal things that we can, right? So for example, when we generate the app, like at build time, we actually generate. So during that build time, which is not like long, it's just like a short build time, we actually generate the whole bindings for the platform. But we mostly generate what we call metadata, right? So we know how to call, like which functions to call dynamically at build time. And then that becomes like a file, a binary file of like, 3 megabytes or something. It can be smaller or bigger depending on how we configure it, right? We generate this small file that is then like directly injected into the binary of your app. So when your app opens, that thing is already loaded into memory, right? So you don't need to like load anything in; it's already there, right? So makes it much faster, right? To access things and find things when we need to. And of course, we do have essentially like we have a couple of overheads, right? So we have like the overhead on iOS, which is first, I mean, we're using V8. We are also expanding on other different engines as well, but we're using V8 underneath, and at least like most other engines are also using some kind of like C++ or right some kind of thing like that. And what happens is, so there's like the traditional cost of like going from V8 like JavaScript to C++, which is big, kind of big, but not really. Like if you, so I mean, if you can do like I think it was like 3 million ops per second, then like if 3 million ops per second in JavaScript, pure JavaScript using V8, and if you like instead replace that JavaScript operation with like a native function call that goes like 2.5 a million ops per second. So it's kind of like it's a negligible thing for the most part. The heaviest part is usually because so you're passing, like you're passing a number, and then the function might receive like an int or might receive a string, and then NativeScript does its best to do the conversion for you. Sometimes, like if you pass a number and the thing requires a string, we're just going to like throw an error because like you're trying to call like a different like a function that doesn't exist essentially. So we'd have to do that.
I think that's a good pause point too, because if you're working in Swift and you try to pass a string to a function argument that expects a number, you're going to get a crash, but more likely your compiler is not going to compile. NativeScript brings the types to the platform. So for most API calls, you also are going to get a compile time error. So, the function signature is actually going to be in TypeScript that it actually accepts a string and not a number. But for any given purpose, if you were to pass something into a function that either the types were weak enough that didn't capture you, you're going to get a similar throw that you would get in Swift or Objective-C land. So your experience working with that language is pretty similar.
Yeah. And I mean, like, we are also TypeScript first, right? So for as well with like generating the metadata, we generate also the types for the metadata. So there's no way for you to, at least like if you're using TypeScript, you're going to like get, build errors if you try to just use different typings. But the other overhead that we have is also like the libffi, right? Essentially, this is on iOS, right? So libffi is what Node uses underneath, and like Dino uses underneath, everyone uses to call functions that you essentially are not built into, right? Eventually, when Apple allows us to use JIT on on their platform or like on their app store, we should be able to improve that even further by just pre-compiling a few hot methods that you're using like quite much, right? But essentially, like, it's around that. We have like a few benchmarks that we've done comparing like mostly like native React Native and NativeScript on like the whole overhead that we take for like each method, right? And it's essentially like if your function does like very little and you're calling it quite a lot, then you're going to take a hit, and you're going to feel that hit. But it has to be like called like quite frequently for that to happen, like thousands of times per second or something, right? But that on Android, so you have like the other side, which is Android uses the Java native interface, so JNI, and that's a bit slower, right? So on Android, we try to limit a bit more of like what the calls that you do, right, to native, but still like fast enough for the most of like use cases. And if you're unhappy with how like that's going, you can just write your own like Java wrapper that does like batches a few operations if you like really needed it. But I don't think we like ever needed that on a project.
This week, we'd like to thank our sponsor, but we don't have one. So if you'd like to sponsor the DevTools-FM podcast, head over to devtools-fm/sponsor to apply. If you want to find another way to support the podcast, head over to shop.devtools.fm. There you'll be able to find all of our cool merch and really rep your nerd swag wherever you go. But if you want a little less public way to support the show, become a member on one of the various platforms where we offer it. There you'll get ad-free episodes, and you'll get the episodes just a little bit earlier. With that, let's get back to the episode. So you mentioned runtimes a little bit there. I saw a tweet from Jamie about how like JavaScript core you can like call directly to Objective-C methods. So like, what explorations are you doing with new runtimes? And like, to me it seems like it would be very hard to change that at all.
Well, I should mention JavaScript core specifically. The NativeScript runtime was originally written on JavaScript core for iOS, and it was extremely mature runtime. Telerik and Progress both did a great job with that runtime. Sometime around 2019, 2020, it was adapted to V8, and V8 had a much more easier to use API, I think, in general. And it was also evolving, in a public way. And so around that time, it was shifted to V8, and all the focus was put onto V8 for really two reasons. I think one was maintenance, but also number two, it aligned the engines between iOS and Android, because Android had always been on V8, and then iOS was on JavaScript core. And so there were very subtle differences between those two. So everyone wanted those two engines to be identical. So they are identical today. Other engines is like right now NativeScript runs on Hermes. There hasn't been a whole lot of information published about this as of yet, mainly because there has been a pull request sort of hanging in flight to bring Node API to Hermes. And, if that lands, I just heard an RC was published with it, and others were invited to sort of experiment with it. We've been working with that for maybe 3 or 4 months now. And we do have some NativeScript examples working, like an Expo, for example. But a public release on that probably wouldn't come until sometime 2025. more because number one, it depends on upstream Hermes changes to support Node API, but also we want to bring the engine to Android before there's a full public release there.
So, like just to expand a bit, like we are also planning on like creating, at least improving our runtimes with like a common API, so that like you could hook, NativeScript into whatever runtime you have, right? So right now, like they are very like focused on like specific tasks, but ideally we want to like completely decouple it from V8. Our like how our whole like object system and everything we want to decouple from V8, and then you can just use that in Hermes or Quick or whatever, like shouldn't matter.
Yeah, I should mention Quick.js as well. There's some other contributors around NativeScript that got it running under Quick.js, which is another engine too. So there's definitely quite a few like adaptations out there, which brings up a good question, like what is NativeScript when you start talking about it in terms of these different engines. And I think it's one of the more interesting kind of conversations around it, because I think originally when it came to market, it really was sort of centralized around a product focus, and I'd say ever since it's been sort of shifted to the OpenJS foundation, NativeScript is more an approach with JavaScript to bring platform development to JavaScript. And so it really is intentional today that NativeScript aims to be as adaptable to any engine and really any environment in which you want to use that approach. And I mean, once a truly drop-in adaptable engine layer is available, then I think that will ring true, I think, to that statement.
This is really fascinating to me. So, I mean, going back to sort of the early conversation about, there being some maybe contention around like NativeScript's approach, I found like I was super excited about it because building apps that like cross layers is like, oh, I want to do all my work in JavaScript, but I have to, integrate with the system at some level. It means that there's like defining foreign function interfaces or whatever, like a bridge for your, app, your JavaScript world to talk to the like hardware world is always just such a pain. And it takes like specific expertise across every platform. And even today, anytime that I do FFI, it's like always, it's still a pain. So it's like, I'm doing some Dino work and I'm like trying to work with like native WebView APIs. And it's like, it just, I mean, Dino is like, Dino and like the Node APIs we have today are worlds better than it used to be, but it's always still a pain. And it's like this idea, this promise is like, oh, like it's all just JavaScript and you can use any of the system native APIs is magic. Just because the idea of it's like all generated at build time.
Be careful of saying magic. People don't like that word.
Well, I mean, it is magic though, right?
our kind doesn't like that word, right? Engineers don't like that word. But yeah, I mean, that is the feeling you get certainly, when you use it. It never wears off. Like that feeling of magic is with you every day when you're working with it. So it's true. I should mention, you mentioned Dino. We have NativeScript working on Dino as well. And actually there may be something out on that in the next couple of weeks for the desktop. But I think the general thinking, like there's sort of this mentality, I think, in development. If you've ever worked day in, day out on somebody who's over your shoulder wanting to say, go this way, go that way, go this way, go that way. And it's always reaching and reaching and reaching and reaching. I think it's always a difficult position to be in as a developer to be able to say, no, we can't do that because our stack. And therefore the question comes up, well, do we need to change our stack to do this? And that's always a difficult decision for any team. And if you've ever been part of a team that's had to migrate from one tech stack to another, it's a, usually a pretty large undertaking, and it can be very painful. I think the general idea with NativeScript is that it leaves nothing off the table. The very essence and spirit of it is that you can do as much Swift UI with NativeScript as you want. You can do as much Jetpack Compose with NativeScript as you want. You can do as much Flutter with NativeScript as you want. And you can even move in between those paradigms as much as you want per case. And that is kind of the essence and point of it. We use React Native plugins in NativeScript today, through a community effort called Open Native. And that's a really brilliant effort led by Amar Ahmed, who's from the React Native community, and Jamie Birch as well. And it's sort of that at least shows what NativeScript brings to the table, I think, in general.
One thing I always like to mention is, like if you can do something native, you can do it inside NativeScript, because essentially NativeScript is just exposing native to you, right? So if you can run React Native in native, you can run React Native in NativeScript. So you can run, if like React Native is able to call, functions like native functions that receive a JSON, sometimes you can just call them from NativeScript as well. So that's like the basis behind Open Native itself, which is just like a layer that does this translation for you.
Do you have to define that layer, or is it like all code gen? Like how much work actually goes into defining all of those APIs?
None, it's all code gen. No, the open native layer is kind of neat because it does handle sort of the Gradle and Objective-C layer, when you bring a React Native plugin in. I should say that right now it's pretty much focused on SDK layer plugins, things like React Native's community NetInfo, for example, or React Native Auth0. We've used that in NativeScript apps before. Those are more SDK level. They're not so view focused. But Amar has allowed Open Native to be working with React Native WebView, which is actually view layer. So the view manager does work in Open Native in NativeScript. Generally, for some pretty complex view React Native plugins, those typically you would probably want to adapt, to some degree. I mean, and yes, it does mean you could use a React Native plugin in Vue. You could use a React Native plugin in Angular. You can do that with Open Native.
I'm as I'm thinking about this, is like when I discovered NativeScript originally, is like the point was just like, or the point that I interpreted at the time was like building apps simpler, just using the languages, like just using JavaScript. And there are some incredibly strong benefits for it. So one is that you don't have to recompile after like every change that you do, even if you're accessing native things. The improvement of iteration speed is huge. And y'all even today have this like preview feature that is absolutely crazy. I think that like other parts in the ecosystem, like Expo is really good and like providing previews too. So the whole sort of ecosystem is like really leveled up, but I still think like NativeScript's preview is pretty wild, because you're, really touching on like native APIs and stuff. And that's impressive.
I think the NativeScript community would love to work with Expo. I mean, more in bringing that stuff to Expo. I think it's important to delineate the line, which is what NativeScript enables is not something that is barred or lined from React Native. I think maybe traditionally in the past that was thought to be the case, but it's really not true. NativeScript and what you can do in preview can also be done in Expo through what we already have working. And of course, when Node API is enabled in Hermes Upstream, you can probably get that right away, certainly for iOS. And it sort of bears the question, what are the use cases in which you would use that? I mean, it's hard to say right now in terms of different projects and challenges that are happening, but you can maybe use it as a quick sort of enabler just to try something out. And then maybe you do want to then write that in a Swift layer, an Objective-C layer, but it's sort of a quick enable access. You can maybe try something out, see if that direction is going to work. And if it does, that's sort of the thing I think we like working with it with professional developments, is that we can tool it when we need to. So if there's a case where we want to drop down a layer, we can, and we're not, it's not a big deal to do so. If for any reason we were building out some view that we decided we wanted to optimize in some particular way, and we want to decide to cut this portion out, maybe do that down in a Objective-C layer, or maybe want to drop that into Swift or even Kotlin, we could do that, and it could still plug into the whole system. We don't have to shift our whole stack to do that. We have, there is an app that I think Ed is even using for his lighting today, that is a NativeScript app where we did a lot of this, and we can maybe talk about it a little bit more in direct relation, because I think sometimes these concepts are hard to talk about on the surface unless you're really talking about it in like real world terms. So we can shift into that in a minute, but I don't want to get too too direct in there just yet.
So you guys have talked about plugins, but like what is it exactly plugging into? Like, is it adding like specific like platform specific files and like bindings, or is it plugging into like the bundler? So yeah.
Great question. I'll let Ed comment on this too. But what I'd say about plugins is plugins are just conveniences, more than anything. I think it also like consistent APIs. I think those are the two forms of which you approach plugins. Number one, can I get this thing working faster? Number two, can I get this working in a consistent way between iOS and Android? Because oftentimes that's the point all along, right? You usually choose some type of hybrid tech because you want to do multiple platforms from one. So those are the most common questions that are easily answered with plugins. The fact is that you can do the plugins, of course, internally to projects, and we've done that a lot, over the years. Where, if a plugin doesn't exist, well, because of what NativeScript enables, you can write a plugin easily inside the project and create your own consistent API if you want. That only makes sense in certain cases. I mean, there are a lot of plugins out there for some pretty concrete cases that you would need. But, I think community size and, when you compare it to the plugin ecosystem around React Native, it's definitely, I think it's hard to compare because that ecosystem is very large.
So like what NativeScript enables, right, is like core API access, right? So like native. But when you're like choosing the technology you want to develop your app, if you are just writing essentially like Objective-C in JavaScript and Java in JavaScript, why you're just like not developing Java in Objective-C, right? So the reason that plugins mostly exist is that more often than not, you probably just want, to install a plugin and, just use like a common API, right? So plugins are usually that. So if you look at like the plugin code specifically, I mean, some of them actually do add some, Java code or Objective-C code or whatever. But mostly you see like, it's like an app Gradle with a specific dependency that gets pulled in, and then we pull in when you install that. And then it's just like, a file for Android, a file for iOS, and like a common API that just interrupts with whatever APIs that you have. So it's more like a very like convenience thing.
Yeah, I think to answer that maybe concretely is what is a plugin is often a pod file. Maybe on iOS, a plugin may bring in a pod file for you that brings in, like if we talk about the Firebase SDK, there's a iOS SDK. So the Firebase plugin for NativeScript would bring in that pod for you and attach it into your project. The include Gradle that would come along with that would also attach the Android SDK for Firebase. And that's often what plugins are doing. They're bringing those platform dependencies in, and then they're providing basically a surface of a common API usually. And that's usually all they are.
Nice. I'd like to talk a little bit about framework integration. So NativeScript has a lot of examples and tutorials on using a web framework that you might be familiar with. So like Vue or React or Svelte or Angular. And we've already kind of talked about like the model is more conceptually similar to React Native than it is to Cordova. It's like, this isn't a web view, it's a native view that you're rendering these UIs to. So how do you bridge the gap between we have this web framework and we want it to render in these native views? Like, what does that translation look like? Do you have to write sort of custom code to like, I don't know, hook into each framework? I know React has its own reconciler, so it's kind of easy to plug in, but I'm not sure how the other frameworks work in that regard.
This is an interesting conversation, Ed. I'm going to let you get into the renderer part. It's an interesting conversation more because of the historical nature around NativeScript Core. NativeScript Core really is sort of like a condensed layer and API that basically uses everything the runtimes provide to create some sort of consistent, API, which is what the web is, right? And so that's where often a lot of confusion comes up. If the web has already got this consolidated API, what is this thing, NativeScript Core? Let's talk about that a minute, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, Core is kind of like the way that I usually like to think about this is imagine like you're developing an app where you're not allowed to use, div or anything like that. What you're allowed to use is web components. So there's a web component that has like a specific layout, a web component that's kind of a web view or a button. So that's how essentially like how NativeScript kind of like works, right? So every component that we provide in NativeScript core actually is just like kind of like a web component that you're using. And then what we have is we usually have to write our own renderer, right? Or extend the existing renderer. So for example, I usually maintain the Angular integration or the Angular renderer. And Angular is like pretty easy to extend. There's just like a class that you just, implement, and then you just, essentially we add everything through JavaScript. So when you add like a child, I just call the NativeScript API that adds a child to a component, and then depending on like what's the the name of the component, I put some kind of I know like if you ask for a button, I know that I have to like get a NativeScript button to put here, right? And that's how pretty much all other frameworks are done, right? And some people think like, well, but why not kind of like just emulate the DOM? Would be you'd think it would be easier to do that. But the problem is, and I think like that's a pretty big problem that I see, is that people don't realize that when you're dealing with a native app, right? So when you're dealing with a web app, you have your browser, and then you're writing your code inside the tab that you're working in, and then the user opens another tab, and it's another like instance, right? When you develop a native app, you're developing the browser. So if the user wants to create like if you want to open a modal, or if you like, depending, like applications now are now able to also be multi window, all this has to be like you have to handle all of these, and it's not like just well, just make a DOM. Okay, how do you represent like two detached DOM trees that when you say like document.add something or create something, how do I know which DOM tree you're adding? So it's kind of like and especially like modal navigation, where you open a modal, and inside this modal you have your own navigation, and once that modal goes away, you want to go back to like the previous navigation that you had in, right? And this is done like on iOS with like view controllers and everything like that, and that's something that DOM just cannot represent. DOM is something that you can open a modal, and then you can replace the contents of a modal that seems like a navigation, but it's not really a proper like native navigation. And if you want native behavior, you're going to have to express things in ways that like the DOM was never thought to be possible to do. So it's more like it's a tricky thing. It's always like a tricky situation, and then sometimes you also like have virtualized lists, which is also like a pretty big deal on especially like mobile, when you have like you have like an app with like a virtualized list. That's always a performance nightmare on whatever framework that you're working on, and you have to express that. And if you express that kind of like in a DOM way, it's bound to be probably inefficient and not exactly what you're looking for. So it's makes more sense to have like you create your own you create your own renderer, and then you use this kind of like web component in a way to like get the result that you want.
So that conversation, I think, also has to be discussed in a way that you talk about divs and a tags and the markup itself. Like, I think a common confusion and frustration is, well, why can't I just use a div or an a tag here? The reality is you really could. There's a register element API, and you could actually register the div and the a and just have that match. And we could even do that for people through core. So why wouldn't we do that? I think in general, to fit all of the web cases that are out there, if you think about taking your website that you have today and using NativeScript to run that on iOS and Android, but run it natively. So now you're rendering it natively, but you're taking your markup that you've already written and run it exactly as is. What exactly is your expectation there? We could render it pretty close, but there are cases like float left, float right on some of those divs, is some of the resetting that you may get on div flow layout, that we can make a general assumption about how that should render in native land, and could probably get pretty close. Jamie has some examples out there where he did exactly that, of using NativeScript to render, I think it was Reddit feed, and he rendered the exact DOM markup actually using NativeScript, and it actually is pretty close. Could you? Yeah, you could do that. And we could probably release something that would just allow you to do that. But then does it bring up this whole complaint of, well, that's not exactly what my, web markup was doing. And now we have this whole other conversation to have. Could it get you most of the way there? Probably. It could definitely be a quick like POC way where you could take some website you've written and just run it natively and then start sort of tooling it from there and make decisions on what you want to do there. So it's a conversation that's been evolving, I think, around NativeScript since the beginning. It's probably closer to being some DOM layer out there that you could use in lieu of another conversation we'll talk about here, which is NativeScript Foundation, which is sort of a new modern evolution of core itself. But we'll touch on that in just a minute.
There'd probably also be like perf concerns with that, right? Because we were talking with like the Tamagui creator, and it seemed like a lot of the work he did to like try to make it more performant is like combining like elements basically so that it rendered the view faster.
Yeah, I mean, you might be the most amazing web markup engineer out there and believe your markup is super tool, but we know there's a lot of nested divs out there on the web. And, if each nested div equates to a UI view and UI kit, for example, on iOS, it's a lot of unnecessary nesting. You can achieve the same layout with one, in native land. And so you can get away with a lot less in platform tooling just by nature of what it provides.
Yeah, another interesting point we had in the conversation with the Tamagui guy was that like React Native, you're basically building, as Eduardo said, a browser, and with that comes a lot of stuff. So like you guys support CSS, which I'm pretty sure it's probably not like real CSS. It's like a translated CSS. So am I right there? And are there other things that you've brought from the web platform to NativeScript to make it feel like you're more in a browser?
Well, my question is, what is real? In the end, what is real?
The CSS and even core discussion back in 2014, it actually, NativeScript was released, I think, March 2014, actually. And so yeah, it has been quite some time. Core originally had factions that were written in native land, and then it was adapted to JavaScript because the runtimes actually provide that ability to do that. And it also sort of opened the door for core to be easier to contribute to, because most people could contribute to JavaScript easier than they can contribute to Objective-C or Java layer. And now today we're talking about maybe taking some aspects of that back down a layer. The reason being that is core itself, when you talk about providing a layer that you can work with something like CSS in the aspects of the web that you want that to be as optimized as possible. So your userland code can get a little wild and willy, and that's fine. But you really want to be building on top of the tightest core foundation possible, because that's what the web platform provides, right? CSS is definitely one of those topics where it's really heavily optimized. I mean, core is an optimized layer for sure. It's not slow by any means. But when we're talking about optimization, we talk in very minutia details. So I think it's important to pick up that oftentimes when we're talking about optimizing, we're not talking about optimizing due to necessity. We're talking about optimizing because we can become freaks about performance. And all of us can be. And so, that's usually what we're talking about. CSS is one of those. It's definitely implemented in JavaScript and core right now. So NativeScript core is what provides the ability to do CSS in NativeScript. That same implementation could be provided by a foundation layer that's done in, say, C++, just the same way. And it's likely that to happen in the future.
Yeah. Additionally for that, the bundler itself, like we don't use like a CSS bundler that just puts some string into your app. We actually convert your CSS into a JSON or like an object, and then that just becomes easier to process at runtime. So we are still doing CSS parsing, and we are setting properties that you set from CSS. But it's just that, it's a subset of CSS, right? It's not full CSS, but it's good enough that it allows you to pretty much style as you would on the web for the most part. And yeah, for sure, it's just it's not like a real, but it's also in the end, the browser is doing the same thing. Like you're passing like a CSS, and it's just going to like parse it and then use it in a way that we can understand.
So the other thing that's sort of interesting about CSS and core is that it's pretty approachable. Like if you wanted to drop a new property in core and make it CSS adaptable, it's actually pretty, like we could do it in like probably 5 minutes on this call right now. It's very approachable. There's a style property class in there, and you can basically flag anything to be CSS stylable, and it becomes part of the style class, and you give it the exact name that you want it to be in CSS. And so it's pretty empowering and sort of fun in that way. But it's also wild in terms of what you could do, because you could introduce a whole bunch of new CSS properties that, you know, are totally foreign to the web. So I think part of the philosophy around NativeScript is not to diverge too far off of it. And I think over time, there were times where it maybe did, you know, in the late teens there, you know, and I think part of what the working group now is trying to do and bring a lot of WinterCG. And WinterCG is, of course, this great group doing awesome work in the space to try to create a common baseline that any innovators around JavaScript runtimes can coalesce around, at least for non-browser environments, which certainly NativeScript is. And you know, we're currently working towards implementing their full WinterCG spec. And that just brings some common expectations, I think, from engine to engine.
I was just wondering if it had opinions on styles, like if WinterCG had any opinion on like CSS or like styles and engines.
I haven't seen that yet.
I didn't. I thought it was just like just JavaScript runtime stuff, right?
Yeah, but ideally, like we want to create like a, you know, we do want to create kind of like a div in NativeScript, and this is like essentially going into the future. We want to create, you know, like our API, which is kind of like you know, or like at least like C++, you know, DOM like API that we want. And it's more like you still were going to be able to use your views and create your views in JavaScript, but it's more like, you know, so that you're not like as punished by being like suboptimal with your layout, right? Because like a lot of times, like if you're just using like margins and paddings, most of the time you don't need like an UI view. You just need like a you know, a different kind of like rendering, you know, or a different kind of like layout calculation. So we could save views there. We are like looking into, I mean, we have like a few projects already, like a plugin that's using Taffy, for example, you know, for that. And then we are just trying to expand that. And then with that and, you know, improving our CSS engine under the hood, that just enables you, you know, it's just like a quick win to improve your performance in your app.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, this interesting thing here, we're sort of like dancing around this conversation, is like all abstractions are leaky, and there's like things you can do to make the environment feel more familiar. It's like, oh, you've done web stuff here, you can do kind of some of the web stuff that you've done before, but like targeted at native. But there's always this question of like the balance of like what you do, because at the end of the day, it's translated into something different. And the more ignorant of that you are, the harder it is for you to build a really performant app, you know, and the more work you as maintainers have to do to build sort of like these, you know, well architected abstractions and really, you know, think about like what you provide and what you don't provide and how you document corner cases and all the stuff that you do. So this is an interesting tension. I saw this back several years ago using React Native and trying to bring React Native components or like across native and web design system, like the Tamagui guy was talking about, but is like, you know, React Native web was the recommendation. It's like, no, we're not going to make React Native like web. We're actually going to make web more like React Native. And it's like, you know, there were all these implications. And in my experience in the company that I worked for, we ended up just like completely divorcing them. You know, it's like, you know what, we're not going to share code at all. We'll just like, you know, share the designs and we'll have different design systems. So this is an interesting and challenging tension.
NativeScript kind of takes that same approach. Like if you're going to do web with NativeScript, which is one of the most common questions, you know, we've got a web app here, we want to, you know, bring iOS and Android on board. You know, our recommendation today, and it's how we do it, is we put in a workspace and then we share all the bindings and the logic. You can share component data. So what you're left with at the end of the day is really just a platform decoration for whichever you are. So ultimately you have DOM markup, you know, for your web stuff. We personally prefer that because you can optimize for each case and you're not sort of stuck in one land or the other. So it allows you to sort of use like the most optimal, best way that you want on a particular one. And instead of being sort of in this just generalized land where, this should generally work there and this should generally work there, I want it to work precisely, as the web's intended here. And I want it to work precisely as it's intended on iOS and Android. And I think that also brings up a topic that I've heard a lot of confusion on, which is the runtime and how that works and how that compares to transpilation. Because I think the term transpilation comes up often when you're talking about these technologies, and it's a very different concept. And what you end up with at the end of the day, and the constraints are very different. Transpilation is really the fact of taking one form and fashion of code and transpiling it into another. So you're sort of transforming into another. That is not at all what NativeScript does. NativeScript doesn't transpile anything. It actually runs it directly as is. And that's a really key philosophical point in approach, because it's really trying to give you how you would work with the platform if you were doing with it in Swift. You're just doing it in TypeScript, and it runs in pretty much the same way. Those calls are being made in the same queue. They're being made against, the same thing. And you're ending up with exactly what you're coding. It's not transformed into something else.
So you mentioned that it might be interesting to ground this in like a real world example, the lights example, but could we dig into that and maybe some of like the tooling and plugins in the ecosystem that you guys really like using?
Yeah, where should we start there? Maybe we'll just start with the ecosystem. I think in general, I think the flavor renders definitely are all contributed by the community. I think Ed mentioned the Angular render, which is really excellent today. The Vue render is done by Igor Rangelovich, who's the working group as well. The React flavor is done by Jamie Birch. The Svelte flavor is done by Hansen, or Hap Nelson, I think, as we know him. And then also the solid layer was done by Dominative, which is oh gosh, Ed, remind me. My mind's going blank. Not Classic Song. I want to call her by her name.
A Yukino song, I think it is, isn't it?
Yukino Song. Thank you. I want to know. She's a brilliant person. She also created this library called Dominative. Dominative has a nice aim to actually bring DOM. So we were talking about DOM emulation. It's really a DOM approach with NativeScript that could enable flavors more easily. Just as is without their own custom renderer. So there's been some discussions around that. Often the NativeScript community plugins, we use a lot of those in our projects. Certainly Martin Guyon, if I pronounce that right. Martin Guyon is the one who often is authoring a lot of those plugins. He does a great job there. OC Fortune also does a great job in the community with things like Canvas. We used a Canvas plugin that he created to do some pretty sophisticated 3D animated and audio-visual work in an app just last year. And those probably top the list, at least for me. I don't know, Ed, if you have any particular call-outs.
I think you hit most of them, actually.
I mean, Valor has a few too. There's a WebSocket one, and if you need WebSockets, the Valor WebSocket plugin is definitely excellent. We just actually adapted that to Vision Pro as well. So there's a Vision Pro slice in there too now.
So something I'm curious about is we've talked about sort of like iOS and Android and even Vision Pro support. And hinted at, potential desktop integration or running on other JavaScript engines like QuickJS or Dino. And desktop integration is an interesting question. This is like, I could see that being very natural for like the OS X ecosystem, because iOS and OS X aren't too terribly divorced. I mean, different, but, in the same ballpark. But like, supporting Windows is a whole different beast, even because there's like a lot of different base generation. So is desktop something that you're thinking about like going into, or are there like other platforms, or how are you kind of thinking about that?
I think it's good to state that platform support is driven in NativeScript by real world need. So if there's a real world project that demands it and wants it, then often it's done. It's not a matter of can it be done. Of course it can be done. It's just a matter of prioritizing. Windows has been done in NativeScript back in 2018, I think was the first time that Windows was done with NativeScript. There's a POC, I think Bungio, who was on the core teams in the past, had done an iteration on that. OC Fortune has also done a Windows iteration with NativeScript. macOS and Catalyst is enabled. You could do some of that today. The Dino and running desktop there, as I mentioned, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, there'll be an example out there where people can sort of explore there, because there has been some work done around that. Desktop support, as far as kind of getting behind and making it as like fully fleshed out in first class as iOS and Android, probably just comes down to having that professional need to do it. I think that's what drives, everything in NativeScript. Vision Pro came about because there's actually a client who wanted that to actually work through that. And so that became available by that. And so, for anyone out there who wants platform support, that's usually how it happens. Desktop, as far as like bringing that fully out, if we were to take it as the approach of Core and adapting all of Core to desktop, right now Core is split out in iOS, Android files. Each of those contain the implementations of those in NativeScript. The same thing would be the case for Mac. You could do a lot of Catalyst stuff currently as is without much difference. Probably more so would be in the boot up process, and some of the kind of initial handling of the app initially, but a lot of the APIs to navigate Catalyst would probably work sort of as is. tvOS is more likely the next one that we would bring to the fold. Actually have a tvOS adaptation up on the iOS runtime right now, which is probably more for like a 9.0 major release in, I don't know if that would be this year, but more likely next year.
Yeah, one thing like to consider is like most of the things that you're going to use going to be like, for example, if you're using Qt or A or whatever, they have like some kind of C++ API. And we on like the iOS runtime, we already have all like the infrastructure to call any C++ API you want to call. So it's kind of like, it's not like a huge amount of work to just bring that into, Windows or Linux or whatever we want to bring. The problem is, like as Nathan said, that then you just, you're not going to just like, okay, so here's like the Windows runtime, or so use this to use Qt, and now you just have to write all your Qt code in JavaScript.
Yeah, we'd want to bring like Core to that. I mean, the reality is you could do Windows, with NativeScript, we were saying today, but no one would really want to do that, for an app build. We'd kind of want to bring Core to it, or we wouldn't want to release that and say this, use this for professional development. We'd want to bring Core probably to it, and that way you can use everything that's documented in the NativeScript docs to do that.
So specifically here, it's like not about the generated bindings. It's like that's a very tractable problem, but it's like the abstractions that exist on top of that and figuring out how to do those in like a way that would support cross-platform, that is more the like longer tail effort that would need to be supported to like really bring this, to the community.
And it kind of goes back to one of those original questions, which is like, well, if I could just use div and a tags and there's my markup, just make that work across all platforms. And the answer is, yeah, we could do that. I think it would just be documenting the edge cases around div nesting and things like that. So, I think the more DOM API is brought into Core, which is some of that discussion that we're sort of hinting at, which is there's NativeScript Core, and then there's this discussion of NativeScript Foundation, which NativeScript Foundation is a new package that the working group is putting together to kind of boil down most likely CSS and C++, some aspects of Core may come out of C++, and it may create a undercurrent underneath Core that'll enable some things like that, potentially more directly and easier maybe.
So what do you guys have planned next? Like, is Foundation the main focus, or are there other big initiatives going on?
Foundation is definitely where a lot of discussions are taking place currently. I think outside of other platform support, like if tvOS comes around for 9.0, I think there'll definitely be some efforts there. but foundation will probably take most of the focus, predominantly, I think. I should mention like bundling support. There's been some questions around Vite. Currently, Webpack is used predominantly. Vite is possible as well. I was just talking with Igor on the working group the other day, and we may actually do something around Vite for ViteConf in October. The main thing with Vite is around HMR. I think enabling HMR through there, I think use import maps to do some of the HMR stuff. And import maps, I don't think are currently supported on the runtimes. So if we wanted to bring HMR through Vite, we'd probably want to make some adaptations in the runtime. But other than that, the bundling would just work. We don't see any trouble there.
Yeah, we're also like improving a few things on the runtimes that are pretty interesting. For example, so now we have, at least on the iOS runtime, we're still like bringing a few things over to the Android runtime. But we have, for example, shared array buffers. So you can share like blocks of memory between your JavaScript and a worker that you create, just another thread. This is already used in an app that we develop, which is the one that I'm using right now to like handle my lights, right? Because usually when you're dealing with this app actually uses a C++ API that just receives like a void star, so essentially like a block of memory, and you just say the length, and then it just like transmits to the network. And what NativeScript does, and like that's like a part of the beauty of it, is that if it sees like, well, this receives like a pointer and you're passing an array buffer, we don't copy anything. We just like we grab the buffer completely and then we send that in. If you want to copy, then you have APIs that you can call to copy that. But ideally, we just send all of that block in. So there's a zero copy, kind of like policy to try to not do any kind of like heavy operation that you're not expecting to happen. So then this is like for Android, it also happens for like.
Ed really should write a post on this topic. I mean, shared array buffers and the discussion around that, and also talking about shared memory, which I think has been rightfully so a common complaint or mark that is used often against NativeScript, because the assumption is that everything is perhaps copied in wrappers, but the reality is you don't have to. And so the shared array buffers actually is a way to avoid that. And yeah, Ed, you should write something on that.
NativeScript, like you can also, JavaScript is single threaded, right? That's like given. Everyone knows that. But the thing to consider is like you can only have one thread access in JavaScript at one specific time, but not the same thread. So you can have like other threads that enter your JavaScript land to do things, then exit, right? Of course, like that will block the main thread if the main thread actually needs to do work. But you can use that for like small things that you just call like a function and it's going to return like on a different thread. You can do that, and or you can use, of course, like workers. And workers just means like there's a new JavaScript isolate, so there's a new JavaScript instance that's running. That's not going to block your main thread, but you can still like pass. Like if you're using like an UI view, or UI view is like a bad example, because if you try to change an UI view on like a background thread, it's going to crash, right? But there are like other objects that you can pass in that are not dependent on any thread, and you can just like send to a worker and then send it back. Or you can just have the same reference on like two different threads and keep working with them, and then you can just interrupt like seamlessly with threads or whatever you want to.
Let's look at that app that you were talking about that does that. So I don't know if you can show that or what's lighting you here. This is an app that Ed and I did work on together, and it has been an exciting development for the both of us, just because it does delve into sort of all these topics that we've sort of been talking about, but it handles a lot of data, and it does so in a very efficient and memory efficient manner using NativeScript. So the app itself is a lighting console meant to be a digital version of like a production playhouse console, one that you would typically see on a desk, and it has a lot of analog controls. This is really just bringing that to the iPad. It does already run on Android and Vision Pro already today. Those releases probably be coming out later in the year. But Ed, I don't know if you can show something on that, or if you can play maybe some effects.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure like if my effect So it's just like, it's like an iPad app. It's at least like iPad first. We are like working on Android versions, and also like it also runs on a Vision Pro. But this is all like an Angular app, right? But uses DataScript, and this like handles like a lot of data. So they have like here's like a very like simple project. Only has like one. Yeah. So you have like here like mostly like the fixtures that I have, which is just one. So and one is already like 20 pixels, right? Then it's quite like heavy, but here like I can change the intensity of the light, but I also can change I can change like the tint, and I can also change the color if I want. So
Oh yeah, there you go. So that, that's those are real-time data feeds coming off the iPad through DMX that's controlling the lights. And it's really I mean, in terms of like the data throughput and your finger to the glass, it's very, very fluid. And yeah, it's sort of the example of why you would use NativeScript maybe, because in this case, a lot of service architecture was done around the data modeling in terms of the user architecture. The structures around the data models were already done in TypeScript. And, that's why you would want to use NativeScript in this case.
yeah, and like for example, we are JavaScript developers, right? So we want also to handle like our state in JavaScript. So all of the state of this app is essentially done in JavaScript, and we will eventually, find ways to portion it, for example, in like multiple workers, because sometimes you have like folder. This is mostly used in film, but it's also going to. We also plan to be using like live event, and you have hundreds of lights of control, and they can't just lag or anything. So we are also like working like partitioning this into multiple, kind of like workers, and maybe not specific to inside the iPad itself, but also on physical or on nodes or whatever. But it helps that the whole state in JavaScript. So if I just use the same code and I share my root state, I'm able to pretty much create a one-to-one copy or one-to-one like exact way of synchronized state.
The thing I'll add on that is we were just invited to Cinegear, which is on Warner Brothers lot, and it's basically a cinematic conference, but we were demonstrating this app there at a booth, and we were invited on set for, I don't know if this show is PG-13, but it's Sex Lives of College Girls. It's actually nothing. It's not as bad as it sounds, but it's Mindy Kaling's show on HBO. We were invited on that set because they used Blackout This app on that set, and they were shooting with it and filming that whole day. And it was neat to see it in that environment because he had, tons of effects running on it. They were shooting like a fraternity party house, and there was tons of lights all around, running the whole time they were shooting. And yeah, that's, this is the kind of stuff that NativeScript's used on for sure.
So we also have like MIDI support. So this is like a Bluetooth MIDI, and I can just use it to control the intensity of the.
Oh, that's awesome.
This is all like, NativeScript we just call like, the MK MIDI API, and then we assign it, and then there you go. Like we get like every time this meets an event, we receive that in JavaScript. And I don't have here, but Nathan actually has one. But there are also like a few of these that have like motorized, right? So when you change on the UI, it also changes. So you see like the physical board changing as well.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Just the two-way MIDI. Yeah, just using core MIDI, So that's nothing. I don't even know if I'd call it magical there, but that's just core MIDI on iOS. Something the platform provides, and we're not having to go around, the bin to use that. I mean, we're just using that in TypeScript.
And that's like the liberating part of NativeScript, where if you want to do something and no one has done it, you don't have to go deep into anything. You don't have to go deep into, okay, how do I create a bridge? How do I you just do it like with what's available. You look into the iOS API, and then you call it.
It's a good example of that plugin question from a while back. When the first thing, when the core MIDI feature came up is, oh, was there a plugin to use that? No, it doesn't matter. We didn't need a plugin, to do that. So that it's certainly, I think when we bring MIDI to Android, then that question comes up, just to kind of bring this conversation back to some points earlier, because we're talking about core MIDI, which is obviously iOS only. So, the app runs as it is already on Android, but for us to enable MIDI on Android, we'd want to enable that layer there. Most likely the way that we'd do that is through just a utility layer. So our utilities would probably end up returning, Android's MIDI system instead of iOS in that case.
Cool. Well, that wraps it up for the questions that we have. Thanks for coming on. This was a really fun conversation that got really in the weeds, and I found it super interesting. So thanks for coming on, Nathan and Eduardo.
Thanks for taking the time with us, guys.
Yeah, thank you. It was very pleasant to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate y'all being here. And I'm still blown away by NativeScript even today. I feel like it was really ahead of its time, and I'm so glad to see it continuing and going strong. So appreciate all y'all's work, and I'm excited to see what you do next.
Thank you. Feel free to state where you want it to go next. I think that's a good way to conclude. If you feel like it should go a different direction, you want something else out of it, it's a community-driven project. Your voice matters as much as ours, for sure.
You heard it, folks.